Uh, Good afternoon. As David said, I'm Ryan Singer, Principal Planner for Long Range Planning and Urban Design here at BPS, and I'm here with Brandon Spencer Hartle. We're here to talk about the Design Review Reform Report, which we prepared at the direction of City Council. So there was a council resolution. And we'll give a little overview of the staff findings, the regulatory reform concepts, and sort of next steps where we're going. Let's go to the next slide, Brandon. So the agenda here, a little overview of the report and the project scope. You know, also for the uninitiated, sort of an orientation to those overlay zones. We'll talk a little bit about how we approach this project and what we found when we started looking at these regulations, and then talk about the reform concepts and where we're going next with them. Go ahead next. So the report scope. So this was initiated by City Council in the fall of 2025. There was a resolution that directed city staff to summarize those existing design regulations, analyze the recent and projected economic impacts to design review in the city of Portland, and then identify temporary and long-term regulatory reform concepts. Project was largely staff driven, so we didn't do a lot of public input on this. This was really more of a fact-finding mission rather than sort of a legislative project that would require public input. And then the report was recently transmitted to City Council with recommended next steps. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brandon. We'll go over the rest of the report.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. It's great to be back with AUDP. I think it's been maybe 6 years since I was last before this group in person in a different era. And so it's great to be back. Most of my engagement at AUDP has been around in the historic resources space, but today we're going to talk a little bit about both historic overlay and design overlay. And we've got a couple other colleagues from the city here today. When we get to Q&A, I'm not going to put any of them on the spot, but if one of them decides that they want to opine, feel free to jump in as well. So I want to just orient everybody. Some of this will be real old information for those of you who've been at this for a long time or who've been engaged with the planning framework here. For others, this may be new. So I wanted to wayfind us in the assignment that City Council gave us. So citywide, we have two primary areas where our zoning code applies design regulations. Those are in the design overlay zone and the historic resource overlay zone, or we'll call it the historic overlay zone for today. Here's a map of where those two zones apply in the city. Together, they apply to about 11% of the city, and I'll talk about each zone in a minute. Principally for the design overlay zone, we have areas that are both inside and outside of the central city. Those are shown on the map here as a darker purple inside the central city and a lighter purple outside of the central city. And that's important for a couple of reasons that I'll get to in a minute. But importantly, the design overlay zone applies to the areas where the city has zoned for the largest capacity development, generally areas that allow a 5-story building or taller. On the historic side, we apply the historic overlay to designated historic conservation and National Register districts. Those include places like Irvington or the Skidmore Old Town historic districts, and conservation districts in North and Northeast Portland like Mississippi, Kenton, and Piedmont. You'll see from the map, and I shall say with the historic overlay, it also applies to individual landmarks, which I'll talk to in a few minutes. As you'll see on the map, the majority of the design and historic overlay area is closer to the central city. We do have a pretty significant application of the design overlay in East Portland and then mid and outer Southwest Portland. And generally, you'll see that the design overlay corresponds to regional and town centers. So those areas with the circles on the map, which our 2035 comprehensive plan anticipates being areas of more significant growth and change. These would be places like Lentz, St. John's, obviously the central city and Gateway. And so there's some overlap there with where the design overlay zone and those designated centers exist. So to dig a little deeper, let me just orient everyone to the design overlay zone. The design overlay zone was first adopted by City Council in a small area of the central city in 1959 as a tool to provide the public opportunity to opine on and experts to guide new development in the areas of the city that are visited by the most number of people and are expected for the highest density development. 1959, that small first application of design overlay zone was expanded in the 1970s to much of the central city, and by the 1990s applied to the entire central city geography and to an increasing number of our mixed-use corridors and centers outside of the central city. Today, the design overlay zone applies to about 7.5% of the city, and like I mentioned earlier, generally places where a new development can achieve 5 or more stories in height. And that's not to say that the design regulations only apply to taller new buildings. They do apply in that entire overlay zone, but generally they are areas expected to grow and change. And the design overlay zone, with some very small notable exceptions, does not extend into single dwelling or lower density multi-dwelling zones like your traditional low-rise neighborhoods. The design overlay zone, as it exists in our zoning code, is in Chapter 420 of our zoning code. It is an overlay zone that works in concert with the base zones that allow for different uses and allow for building envelope scale, mass of buildings. They're intended to work together with the design overlay zone, advancing 3 tenets of design. Those of you who have been at this for some time may remember the Design Overlay Zones Amendment Project, or DOZA project, which was the last time that the City Council made major changes to the design overlay zone in that project with advice from the Design Commission, Planning Commission, and many members of the public. We narrowed the intent of the design overlay zone to really advance 3 core tenets of design. Those core tenets, as adopted, are response to context, both built environment and natural environment, the relationship between development and the public realm, and then the quality and permanence, the quality and resilience of new development or alterations to existing development in the zone. So those 3 core tenets are infused into the pathways to approval in the design overlay zone. Design overlay zone, as I mentioned, really isn't, it's intended to work with our base zones that allow for different uses and intended to complement the development capacity that's allowed in those base zones. Generally speaking, there's 3 paths to approval in the design overlay zone. One, a long list of projects that are exempt entirely from the regulations of the overlay zone. This would be things like painting a previously painted surface, standard improvements in the right of way, and a long list of smaller, more benign alterations and new development projects, including all the way up to allowing for small middle housing type uses in the design overlay zone. So those are called exemptions. They're development activities that are identified in the code as exempt from the regulations of the zone. Outside of the central city, Oregon law requires the city of Portland to provide an objective or prescriptive path to approval using objective design standards. Those standards exist in the zoning code and are presented as a combination of required design standards and a menu of standards of which an applicant needs to achieve a certain number of points. And those objective standards are measurable, they are clear, and there's no discretion involved in their application. And then we have discretionary design review. And discretionary design review in Portland can either be a staff review, we call it type 1 or type 2 review, or staff at the Bureau of Portland Permitting and Development review an application against adopted design guidelines, or a type 3 review where our city design commission, of which we have 7 members, reviews a proposal against the design guidelines. Discretionary design review is required for new development and alterations in the central city, the downtown area, that are not exempt from design review. And discretionary design review is an allowed alternative path to the objective or prescriptive design standards outside of the central city. When City Council passed the resolution directing staff to look at the design regulations in the city, this is primarily what they were asking us to look at. However, Council also wanted us to take a look at the historic overlay and look for those regulations in the historic overlay that could similarly be evaluated that pertain to design. So for those of you who are less familiar with the historic overlay, it applies to approximately 4% of the city. It was first adopted in 1968 with the establishment of the Landmarks Commission and the city's first designated landmarks and districts. It applies, like I said, to designated landmarks and districts, so everything from the Pittock Mansion to the Halpern Open Space Sequence, which is a small historic district. And the intention of that overlay zone is to implement federal, state, and local historic preservation policies. Similar to the design overlay zone, about 5 years ago, City Council adopted significant amendments to the regulations of the historic overlay zone through what was called the Historic Resource Code Project. I got to come before AA several times and talk about that in its early iterations, and that made some significant tweaks to the regulations and the code provisions. But we thought this would be an opportunity for us to get another look at the design regulations. Very similar to the design overlay zone. For alterations and new developments in the historic overlay zone, some activities are exempt. Minor mechanical equipment, interior alterations, painting previously painted surfaces, certain fences, small detached accessory structures, all exempt from the historic overlay zone. In conservation districts, which are all in Northeast Portland, we do have an objective or prescriptive path similar to what we do in the design overlay zone, different standards, similar idea. And then we have discretionary historic review, which I think many of you are probably familiar with. Works similar to design review in that there's a staff option for smaller projects. That would be a type 1 or type 2 review. Staff review a proposed new development or alteration against design guidelines, or larger projects that go through the Historic Landmarks Commission type 3 review. So we've intentionally built a code so that there's similarities between the historic and design overlay zones and how they're implemented. The approval criteria, the intentions are different, but we do have some parity there. And so we wanted to look at that in this assignment from City Council. So as Ryan mentioned, we back in the winter received this assignment from City Council. City Council is excited about getting reports back relatively quickly. And so with this one, City Council provided a 120-day timeline, asking staff to study a range of issues that Ryan mentioned earlier, and to bring back a report that helps the City Council better understand how the historic and design overlay zones operate, their history, their purpose, and to provide council with an assessment of the economic consequences of specifically design review, and give them a flavor of what code amendments could be a right picking for future reform. Ryan and I worked with a couple others here at the Planning Bureau, including an economic planner and our lead urban design planner, and then staff at PP&D, primarily Tim Heron, Stacy Monroe, and Cara Fioravante, but also staff on the permitting and other land use services teams that touch on the design overlay and historic overlay zones. It was a quick assignment, but we thought it was important to take a look at recent design review cases in each of the 4 city council districts to get a sense of what's been reviewed and approved in recent years, where maybe there were some rubs in the design review or some opportunities in design review to modify other development standards or to achieve design solutions that the design commissioner staff helped an applicant work through. And so in the report, you'll see about a dozen case studies. We looked at recent projects that did get design review approval. And then again, time was limited and it was really a staff exercise, but we sought to analyze recent permit and land use review data in the design overlay zone to get a good sense of what's been happening after the adoption of the design overlay zone amendments project 5 years ago, and to bring back to council under better understanding of what we're seeing in each of the council districts with respect to development in and out of the design overlay zone. I mentioned we were on a tight timeline, and largely this was a staff-driven exercise. We did hold a listening session with the Design Commission and another one with the Historic Landmarks Commission, and we were able to meet with individual historic landmarks and Design Commission members to get better insights into their experience as commission members and decision makers in those type 3 reviews, and get their thoughts about where there could be opportunity for code reforms. And then we did interview approximately 13 people within the development industry. We did talk to a couple of architects and designers, but primarily what the council was interested in was hearing from representatives of the development industry. So we did talk to, I think, 9 or 10 professionals who are in the business of development here in the city, both historic and design overlay zone, new development. So those are interesting interviews. Sometimes the developers brought their preferred architect along, sometimes did alone. We talked to both private developers and a small handful of nonprofit and public developers too. So we had a tight timeline. I do want to say we had talked about coming to this group during that 120-day timeline, or there was interest in us joining this group during the research period, and ultimately staff, we were so constrained on our timing, and council was so specific in what their request was that we wanted to give it some time after the publication of the report for us to provide a level playing field for public conversation, so that people had a source of truth document in the report that they could opine on the design standards and design review criteria and those types of things. The report's available online. I should have said that. It's a relatively lengthy document. About half of it is background information, and the other half is analysis and a summary of these reform concepts that I'll share in a moment. But we've been sort of trying to characterize what we found, and I want to keep it at a high level for today, and we can get into more detail on the questions. But I do think it's important to, and I think most people in this room are well aware of this, to sort of orient us into the development world that we see both on the street in Portland and also in the land use review and permit data citywide. This is a chart of new construction permits, commercial occupancy CO permits submitted from 2016 to 2025, so a 10-year period, from what was essentially the height of our most recent development boom in the 2015-2016 time period to what's become the nadir of what we've seen in larger commercial multifamily and other commercial use permits. The black line at the top is projects that are not in the historic or design overlay zones that again are commercial permits. And then at the bottom, and I'll leave this up for a minute so we can take a look at it. You see projects in purple that are in the design overlay zone, and then blue in the historic overlay zone. Historic overlay zone, we generally have not zoned to expect significant new development. There are development opportunity sites. We want to work to continue to refine the viability of developing on those sites, but there are significantly fewer development opportunity sites than in the design overlay zone. So in historic, you see there's a handful of projects that have gone through either historic review or met the historic standards over the last 10 years. Not that many. More common to see alteration projects or smaller residential code projects in those places. But in the design overlay zone, you do really see the drop off in development activity in the last 5 years. And this is where City Council hears it. They have a sense that this is the reality on the street, but one of the intents of the report from City Council was to better understand what are we seeing in terms of development, where is the development happening, and give them the background they need to make policy choices going forward with respect to regulations and other things they might be thinking about outside of just the narrow world of design. We also, and this is was a challenging exercise without having the time or the ability to bring in an external consultant. We wanted to give council a sense of the economic costs and benefits of design regulations. Specifically, the request from council was to look at design review and the design overlay zone. So we didn't evaluate the design standards or historic review. We wanted to be pretty narrow and just give council language that they could use and the public could use to help weigh in the future evaluating the different ways that design regulations may increase project cost and the different ways that the design regulations might have some economic benefits, both for the applicant, but also for the neighborhood that the development is taking place in the city as a whole. And so in this section of the report, if people are interested, we really wanted to get the insights from those development professionals and what we've done locally in the past to look at the hard costs, the soft costs, and the perceived cost or the sort of predictability costs of design review, and provide a relative order of magnitude of what those costs might be. Our neighbors to the north in Seattle, they have currently a design review system that is suspended for a couple of years while staff modify and reform some core components of their design regulations. Importantly, we were able to look at what Seattle planners had contracted out 4 or 5 years ago to give them a sense, or their city council a sense of economic cost of design review there. During our design overlay zone amendments project a few years back, we did bring an external consultant to help us understand economic costs. And so that section of the report is one that if we had more time, if we had some outside resources, we would like to tighten that up a little bit. But hopefully the report gives people some language that they can use to debate the merits of different pieces of the puzzle. We did hear from development industry representatives a couple of things. One, design review can cost a little bit of money. Predictability is an important factor, and for the perceived cost of design review is an important factor that they thought staff should be thinking about. But we did hear near unanimously the value of urban design and Portland's approach to urban design being a benefit for institutional, long-standing developers who do work here. And so it was exciting for me, and I think Ryan, you could jump in too in a few minutes if you want to talk to that more in the Q&A. But it was really interesting for us to have the opportunity to share a draft of the report with the development industry representatives and hear them talk to the merits of the good work that the commission's PP&D staff and then the design community here generally have done to set Portland apart from other places, and that there's a citywide value in the framework that we've put together, and that it is a helpful piece of economic recovery and what they see as the long-term forecast for setting Portland apart as having a competitive advantage with the built environment that we've planned for and that we're achieving. And so we wanted to make sure that that thought was reflected in the report as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the reform concepts. As I mentioned, City Council did direct staff to bring back concepts that could eventually become either temporary or permanent changes to how we manage design regulations in the city. Council was quite clear to us at the staff level, and when we had conversations with council members, they were clear yet again that they did want to see what temporary suspension of some or all aspects of design review could look like. They were interested in what Seattle has done, using a moment of slow development to sort of reorient the thinking and revise design guidelines, code thresholds, other development standards that might relate to design review. And I think wanted us to sort of take a look at what that could be and put that on the table for discussion. And so they'll see that here, and we'll talk more about what that would look like in a minute here. And staff, like I said, we put our heads together. We had good feedback from the Design and Landmarks Commission and those development industry representatives. We looked at other cities, other peer cities. What are they doing in San Francisco? What are they doing in Austin? What are they doing in Seattle? And a few smaller cities as well, just to kind of see, okay, what's the universe look like right now with respect to design regulations? And staff presented 8 reform concepts in the report. I should say none of these reform concepts are neither Design or Landmarks Commission voted to support these reform concepts. Staff wanted to set the table for discussion. We did in the report prioritize what we thought would be the economic sort of impact of each of these 8 ideas and which ones maybe rise to the level of priority within our comprehensive plan and what we've heard from the public. But in general, we wanted to give council enough to think about and enough different directions they could go with respect to a future legislative project. Our colleagues over at Portland Permitting Development, as everyone I think here is probably well aware, have for many years now been in a sort of constant process improvement mode, looking for ways to improve the applicant experience, looking for ways to better ensure that the commissions are able to do their work and that staff have the tools that they need. And while we did make some major changes to the processes that support design review in recent years, we were able to identify a list of potential additional process improvements to support the smooth delivery of design review approvals and the application of those design standards. And so that is described in the report. That is something that wouldn't necessarily need to go back to City Council, but is something that we definitely felt has some merit to improve the regulations we have today. The second and third idea are the temporary suspension ideas. The second idea on this list here would allow any review that currently goes to the Design or Historic Landmarks Commission, a Type 3 review, to be eligible for a Type 2 staff review. We already do that for certain housing proposals on a temporary basis. That has been relatively successful. And so what we wanted to do is to give a flavor of what a temporary suspension to a process might look like, but still upholding the application of design review and do that in a way that would still engage the 2 commissions in review, but make the decision a staff decision. So a little technical, we can talk more about that one in a few minutes. But as an alternative to that, a more aggressive alternative, and again, really responding to the council direction here, We did put forward what it would look like to temporarily suspend required design review for a period of a couple of years, where for that time period, any project in the design overlay zone could avoid discretionary design review and meet the objective design standards. And that's very different than what we've done in the past, where in the downtown area, design review has been presumed for any larger new infill project in the design overlay zone. And so that is definitely the more aggressive move that would be very different than what for actually more than a generation, a couple of generations we've been used to in the downtown area. And that would be a policy choice that the city council would need to adopt as a temporary amendment to the zoning code. And we'll talk more about that one in a minute. One thing we heard near unanimously is that our downtown design guidelines are outdated, overwhelming, and not aligned with where we're trying to go in the 21st century with the downtown. And this is something that the Design Commission has flagged for many years. Past councils have heard of, and something we certainly heard from development industry representatives is that the design guidelines or the approval criteria that apply downtown for design review are in desperate need of a rethink. And staff agree, and the commissions, I think, feel strongly about this being a high priority that, you know, in the new reality that we live in and in the moment we're in of rethinking what downtown looks like and what it could do, updating the design guidelines for downtown could be a critical part of that. The last recommendations I want to talk about, so the design overlay zone, like I mentioned, had some pretty significant amendments to the code requirements back in the design overlay zone amendments project. We think there's some opportunities to continue that work with code amendments. This would be code amendments that might allow for substantial conformance after a design review if there's a supplier change or a need for a small exterior change. Revising some of the thresholds for what level of review certain proposals go through design review, how much exterior alteration might be exempt from design review. We've detailed those in the report, but there's sort of a package of code amendments that could improve design review without making any sort of significant walking back of the intent of the design regulations. And then I won't talk about these in great detail, but we do have three recommendations that would pertain to historic review. One is something we've already done in the design overlay zone, which would be to guarantee the base height and floor area for new development in historic and conservation districts. This has been a topic for many years of discussion. There's some nuance here with respect to state and federal law, but we do think there's an opportunity to look at new development in historic and conservation districts and trying to remedy what has been a occasional conflict between historic review and the development capacity that's allowed on the zoning map. And then the last couple, looking at historic district guidelines that are outdated to better accommodate new development, and taking a look at those conservation districts in Northeast Portland. They've been around for a long time, but they're at a right point in their lifespan to take another look at their size and the regulations that apply there. So those are the concepts that staff identified in the report that was shared with City Council a couple of weeks ago. The directors at the Bureaus of Planning and Sustainability and Portland Permitting Development, Eric Engstrom and Eric Kutch, alongside the staff recommended staff reform concepts in the report, did identify these three as a place that they would suggest City Council look more closely at in the months ahead as a package to consider in the fall or early winter. And so when the report was transmitted to City Council, the director's recommendation to Council was that they hold off on doing anything and let the staff bring them up the report and a package of a sort of legislative package that would do a couple things. So I mentioned a few minutes ago, the temporary suspension is something that's popular in cities right now as a way to juice development and redeploy staff and energies towards other work during this slow time. And so what our directors have suggested to council is temporarily suspending design review, allowing any project to pick the prescriptive path in and out of the central city, and to do that alongside a redeployment of staff to rewrite the central city design guidelines and to develop and bring forward the list of more permanent code changes to design overlay zones. So the idea would be City Council would temporarily suspend required design review. Staff would spend energy over that temporary suspension period to advance more permanent reforms with the downtown design guidelines in the code, and to bring back revised design guidelines and code as a parallel to that suspension period ending. The thinking is that this would take about 2 years, maybe a little more than 2 years. And so a temporary suspension might look like a 2-year suspension to design review. Ultimately, the way that a suspension would work is that the Planning and Sustainability Commission would need to recommend to City Council a code amendment to suspend design review, and City Council would need to, by majority, adopt that code amendment and to give their blessing to the work plan that would bring back those permanent reforms to close out the suspension period. This is something we know the Design and Landmarks Commissions have been discussing after the report was made public and the director's preferred path was daylit. I think a lot of people will have thoughts on this. I certainly have thoughts too, having worked on this for quite some time. Ultimately, this is a city council decision, and ultimately the city council did want to see what a temporary suspension would look like before they made a vote to make any changes. And so the sort of anticipated next steps from this timeout, like I mentioned, the report's been transmitted to council. The recommendation of those 3 reform concepts being advanced was shared with city council at that time. To my understanding, that works for city council as a direction. And we will be seeing a temporary suspension package that includes that work plan and sort of reallocation of staff brought before the Planning Commission for a hearing, and then ultimately to City Council for adoption vote. I'm not counting votes, so I don't know how City Council feels about the temporary suspension or the work plan. But the thinking is that by the end of the year, we can bring them a package for them to hold the public hearing and deliberate and decide on the right policy direction. If everything goes according to the sort of the fastest possible timeline to give this to City Council for their consideration, there would be a Planning Commission hearing sometime in the late summer, again, to consider a temporary suspension and a work plan, and then a City Council hearing and adoption vote sometime in the late fall. And so if you're looking at your calendars, sometime that last week of August is very likely for Planning Commission, and sometime in the holiday season is when City Council would consider their next steps. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot of directions we can go with the conversation. I've got Ryan here to answer questions too. And ultimately, if you haven't had a chance to look at the report, it is online. Like I mentioned, the director's recommendation is there as well for people to get a good sense of where they're wanting us to go. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks for having us. I'll turn it back over to staff or the chair.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon. Ryan, it's really helpful. Yeah, I think you laid out a great kind of overview of where this conversation is at and next steps. So we got a lot of good questions already. I'm gonna just kind of go through them in order. And as you mentioned, feel free to kind of pick on your peers at BPS as well if you need to. Let's see. David had a question. What would design guidelines reform include greater flexibility in mixed use downtown? If you could expand on the feedback. Maybe this is a separate question. I'll let you get that one first. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and Ryan, maybe you can too. The design guidelines don't dictate use. And so the use is something that the base zone would already allow in most areas in the downtown. There are some areas of downtown that are industrial, zoned for industrial uses primarily, and so there's some constraints there. But generally, the design guidelines and the design overlay zone are agnostic to what use is happening behind the envelope. That said, currently in the downtown, when a project comes in for design review, either for new development or alterations, there are many approval criteria that a project needs to meet. In some cases, it can need to meet 40 or 50 something design guidelines or approval criteria. The opportunity really exists to focus that list of approval criteria on the things that are most critical to the built environment and most relevant to the central city that we want to see in the future, so that there can be greater sort of both greater focus and greater flexibility for applicants who are looking to integrate a new development into the built environment in ways that today is possible, but does require that extra set of gymnastics to meet all the approval criteria.
Great. There's a question. Would you mind expanding just on the type of feedback you received on the value of design review for allowing innovation in design, better quality urban design as a community value or community benefit? And just kind of how you're maybe dissecting the economic benefits, not being just a barrier to design, but also a benefit.
Yeah, it's a good question. Having been at the Planning Bureau for a long time, typically a project like this would go out and talk to a broad spectrum of the community, hearing from voices that are represented and less represented, so we could come to a conversation like this with a more robust and equitable understanding of what the community is feeling. Time, budget, council direction didn't allow that for the report, and so I can only speak to who we did talk to, but I think we certainly we heard a design commission. I don't know if any of them are here today. We heard a design commission who were very clear about the value of urban design and the city's design regulations, and also very open to evolving those design regulations to meet the moment that we're in today and where they expect the city will go in the future. When we talk to development industry representatives, and I'm going to take the designers out of this category, but those people who hire a designer, hire an architect, what we heard was positivity about the development opportunity in the design overlay zone because the neighboring new development either already has or in the future would have that higher quality design expression that would give some confidence about building in those places and what is likely to occur in the future. And we also heard, and this I think we tried to put words to it, concern that in the Central City with the current Central City fundamental design guidelines, unless you are a seasoned Portland design team, it may be hard to see the path for innovation in the Central City. It may be hard to apply the approval criteria that exist today in a way that gives confidence that something different or unexpected is approvable. And we did hear, the difference between people who are familiar with this, who have gone through the process many times, who know how to apply the approval criteria, and maybe a newer design team, either newer to the Central City or newer to the region, who look at the long list of approval criteria and see that the opportunities for innovation the perception is that they're limited. And so I think with the Central City fundamental guidelines, the excitement is how can you create the right approval criteria or design guideline framework to prioritize the core tenets of design while making it very clear where and to what degree innovation and expression is acceptable so that those newer teams can get it on their first read of the approval criteria. And that, I'll say, was where the public process, presuming that council agrees that the Central City fundamental guidelines have an opportunity for update, I think that's where there'll be an opportunity really to make sure we get them right, both at the design commission level and in the public hearings process so that people who weren't represented in our report project can have the opportunity to opine on that.
Very clear. Michael O'Brien wants to know, he's curious to understand how PP&D and council views the difference between type 2 and type 3 reviews in terms of outcomes. Is there a discernible difference between two in project? So two inbuilt projects. Yeah, I guess I had the same thought. It's just if you had two comparable sites, one inside the design overlay, one outside, is there kind of a side by side?
It's a good question. And in the report, it's one of the reasons why we wanted to provide those case study examples. So like minds could maybe come to a similar or different position. I don't know that I saw, and Ryan, tell me if you did. I don't know that I saw a difference in outcome. The development product, either through a staff review or a design commission review. There certainly is a different process value. Design commission allows the public an opportunity to go before the body and talk to the approval criteria and talk to the project. The public can still comment on a staff level review, but there's not that public hearing where materials are shown on the screen and there's different iterations that people can digest. And so we definitely heard more about process and outcomes on the two levels of review. That the staff process, there are some pros and cons, and the design commission process, there are some pros and cons. But the outcome generally looks pretty similar since the approval criteria are intended to be applied similarly. But then I will say, I guess the type 3, there were plenty of examples that we heard that a member of the public or a design commissioner helped a project get better because of their knowledge of past work or their understanding of the site or their familiarity with materials or some contextual item that it wouldn't necessarily have occurred to the design team. And these aren't necessarily huge programmatic changes, but oh, hey, this is the building next door has this really significant thing that happens. Is there a way to integrate that space a little differently? Or, oh, the way the sun casts on this site, the tree may not survive in that location because you look at it over here, or things like that. So we definitely heard that there were some positives to the public process. There are also some costs, more professional design services to come before the design commission. And I don't think those numbers are huge as a part of the project cost, but they're real cost. And that's a potential to return for the commission can have a perceived cost too.
Right. And I'm actually going to hop in with my own question because I think it relates to this, but just it feels like there's a little bit of thinking about what how staff would be refocused on other efforts, but is there any consideration for how the design commission body could be utilized in an alternative way that helps shape projects, maybe not in a regulatory forum, but just that they are a really knowledgeable body that I wonder if they would have a role in some form of other kind of crafting of our city, public realm.
Definitely. And just for a quick reminder, that is if we were moving forward to the downtown design guideline rewrite, the design commission is a necessary recommending body to city council on those design guidelines. And so what the rule exactly looks like, we need to figure that out, but the design commission would definitely have their fingers in both the design guideline update and the code amendments in a way that would be paired with the planning commission making the sort of formal legislative recommendation on the code amendments. I think too, we have great design commissioners. They're thoughtful. Some of them have been around a long time. We've got some new energy on the commission, and they're definitely a resource, even with the report, that we have an asset in the design commission, and we also are slow on work. I think that the commission, you look at the workload the last handful of years, and you look at the chart I shared, they do not have the volume of cases that they had in the 2015 to 2020 period. And so making sure that we can use their expertise towards the framework that comes next, I think is definitely on everyone's mind.
Great. Thank you for addressing that. Next question. David McElmayo has gone, but wanted to know what would an objective or prescriptive regulatory staff review process take away from having design review?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the state doesn't require us to have design review. They allow it, like I said, in the downtown area or as an alternative to those standards. But the design standards are prescriptive, and so you don't end up with the flexibility and options to respond to context or to leverage unique site conditions if you follow the prescriptive path. And additionally, for the next 6 years, the state legislature has allowed for automatic adjustments to certain design development standards, meaning some of the design standards in practice don't apply for the next 6 years. And so for the built environment, the effect on the built environment, many elements of new development and alterations that are critical to the built environment would not be subject to either the process of design review that has some value or to the rigor of thinking about the built environment through the standards, because standards don't always apply, and or the state has allowed that flexibility, meaning that exterior materials, for example, we don't have the ability for the next 6 years to regulate those through standards in the ways that we did before. There's some information in the report. We could definitely talk more about what that looks like. But the tangible outcome would be those three tenets of design: context, public realm, and quality and resilience. With a standards approach, would allow for a product that doesn't achieve the same level of quality and sort of excellence in the built environment.
Awesome. Rob wants to know, did developers share ideas of century downtown looks like? and why the current code limits them from achieving that vision.
I don't know if I should say this, and Ryan, maybe you could jump in. I mean, I think what we heard from the developers is, what a 21st century downtown Portland looks like is a 21st century downtown where outside investors want to park money. Like, I think they were very clear that part of our exercise is to showcase the best of the city and showcase the city's marketability as a place for investment. And we didn't get into detail, design details
Yeah.
or what that would look like, but we definitely heard, I want to be able to call, to be frank, like I'll quote one of our people we talked to, I want to be able to call a crypto bro who needs a place to park money in real estate and convince him that downtown Portland is the place. So it was just interesting, it was less about the design features. And they all had positive things to say about the design commission and their designers that they've worked with and others. But their head was really in, how do I get a project going?
Yeah, I'll add to that is that I don't think the developers that we spoke to anyway were really sort of thinking, and we didn't really ask them, so we weren't asking them what the vision for the central city is. But I think specifically downtown, and BPS is doing other work on this, is a vision that includes a lot more housing and probably more sort of a more of a functional neighborhood that doesn't, it's not as dependent on the ebb and flow of office workers as it has in the past. And to do that, we need people to invest, right? So we need investors. And also you need that to you need those buildings to look nice, because if people are going to be living downtown, they want to be living in a place that is a good place.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, Devati. Messaging discretionary equals flexible, not subjective. Flexibility allows for innovation, individuality, unforeseen situations, i.e. a city. Design review should be seen as a win-win and is when staff and applicant work in good faith and one another towards a greater good. I think we've seen that, yeah, on a lot of projects.
I think we just agree with that statement.
Jill says, are there similar conversations happening around reforms to the land use review process outside of the overlay districts? Great question.
Ryan, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, not at BPS that I know of. Yeah.
Megan asks, are there current exemptions being reviewed as part of this program? Or are there current plans to review potential exemptions for projects providing affordable housing in Portland, similar to Seattle design review, new exemption?
Yeah, I think the exemptions are interesting because when in the code, it's a relatively blunt tool. And when the code exempts something from, let's say, the design overlay zone, it doesn't enter into that chapter. And so I think that there's the opportunity to grow the list of exemptions, certainly, to allow more things to avoid the design overlay zone regulations altogether. And I think that in the code package that we're envisioning as part of the work program, we would certainly be taking a look at what would it look like to increase those exemptions. For example, in historic review a few years ago, we added an exemption to allow new detached accessory structures with no review, provided they met a few prescriptive standards. And we're seeing those things we're seeing new ADUs built in the 11th edition, Irvington Historic Districts, no historic review. That's a big change from the past when those things were subject to a type 3 historic landmarks commission review at one point, and then a type 2 staff review. And so the exemptions, it's a pretty powerful tool because it says this type of work is not subject to the regulations. There are pros and cons because if you exempt it and it's a very special site that really should have some thought given to it, we wouldn't be able to say, oh no, not for this project. So definitely that list can grow, and I think that's part of the public process with the code package would certainly allow for that discussion. What could an exemption look like?
Yeah, we need to walk a fine line here, especially as it pertains to affordable housing. One of the things you want to make sure that you sort of achieving is that there's still design excellence for affordable housing buildings. And if you can, the building that you can sort of point at and say, oh, that's affordable housing. That's not sort of a good outcome. I think what we want to do is have affordable housing buildings that look like every other building that are, in the city. And so, that's that we want to make sure that we're sort of achieving that. It's almost like an equity goal, really.
Great. So I think that's kind of the end of the questions that we've got queued up. I would encourage anyone that has something brewing on their mind to go ahead and put it in the chat. I think I would just wanted to also maybe build on kind of the question I had earlier about the role of the design commission in the near term, just opportunities. I think there's a lot of benefit from the design advice request process. Like, is that also just a throwing out ideas, something that has a lot of value to the community that could still be accessed from the body of volunteer commissioners? And kind of how would
Definitely.
that play into your recommendations?
Definitely. And we explored that. We explored that in several ways, and we looked at the long-term and temporary options. I shared earlier one of the temporary options, the one that we're not being sort of encouraged to advance at the moment, would be to allow anything that today goes to the commission to be a staff review only following a design advice request or DAR meeting. So it'd be an opportunity for the commission to give early guidance at maybe the right moment in a project, and then let the review move to staff. And we do that today for a handful of projects, mostly housing projects and affordable housing specifically, that we allow for that staff level review following a design advice request. We didn't want to require, we probably played some options. We didn't want to require applicants to go through a design advice request when they didn't have to go through design review following, because we thought that it could confuse the public and put the design commission in a place where they're just they are, what do I want to say? It could be it could be a bad way to build respect with the design commission if you require a design advice request and then the design commission provides a bunch of great ideas and the applicant chooses just not to do any of those. And so we weighed, well, what if we require design advice request? And it was up to the applicant, and we thought, this could just be a bad way to message to the public what we're really doing here. And so we didn't explore that.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think your comment earlier about kind of like leveling the playing field amongst those who are really knowledgeable about the existing guidelines versus those who want to enter the space. I think that could be an interesting venue to kind of like share a little bit of expertise. Let's see, we just have a couple minutes left. I guess kind of one follow-up question, and then I do want to end with Dave's question about engagement. Is just seems like staff has a lot of input towards council. I'm curious a little bit more about the council's interaction with the design commission. Do they get to chat with each other? I know there was a state of the city presentation maybe a couple months ago, and I think that was not to the council itself. Anyways, just curious about that kind of interface and if there is any as part of this process.
Ryan, would you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that the role of the design commission, and we have a whole new council, and so there is still some, I think, amount of like figuring out what the whole city. It's a big city. There's a lot happening, and I think they're still trying to figure some of that out. We did use this report as a way to really try to educate the counselors as to, there's a design commission. Here's what they do. Here's what they're composed of. Like there's requirements for being on the design commission. Commission. They're all, experts in the various fields. And so, I think that piece was helpful. We did have a few of the counselors sort of, say to our leadership, oh, I'm going to watch one of their sessions, or I'm going to, sort of attend and sort of hear what happens so that they can get a flavor for that. And I think that was helpful, right? In terms of understanding what's happening there. So I think there's still probably room for improving on that.
One thing I'll add, and I think it's getting at Dave asked, how can the group engage? And I think it's related. We have 12 council members. They represent 4 different districts. And maybe I'll eat my words of this. None of them are designers or architects. They may think they are, They probably all think they are, but they're not really. And a lot of you are, most of you are, in the design commission, most of them are. And I think the council really values hearing from members of the public who are invested in the city and thoughtful and curious and are here to play a role in its future. And staff, we can present them with information, we can provide the analysis, but I do think that for this council, my observation has been that members of the public who provide them with information and help them know all the different facets of the city and how it works and how it could work better, there's a lot of value there. And so in the months ahead, I'd say two things. One, if you have an opportunity to engage with your council members, do it. Talk to them about design, talk to them about the city, talk to them about development, help them make informed decisions. And two, if this continues down this road, there will be a planning commission hearing and a city council hearing, both of which would benefit from robust testimony, thoughtful testimony, and testimony thinking about not just past experiences, good and bad with design regulations, but about what design review and design overlay zone can do to help the city go to the place it needs to go next. And I think the council and the planning commission really benefit from that knowledge and those perspectives.
Well said. Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. We are at 1 o'clock, so I will let everyone off. I'll just maybe echo Megan's comment. This was a really thoughtful conversation. It's a sensitive topic. Really appreciate your work on this, and I hope everyone can engage where they would like on the discussion moving forward. Thank you all for your time. We will have a topic in July. We don't have it posted yet, but got a couple things in the works, so please watch for our updates there. Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.